Wendell Baker rams a fresh round into the breech of a gun he has never fired in anger, and the second Panther in front of him is already burning. He is a replacement. 19 years old, out of a depot pipeline that had promised him gunnery school and delivered him instead to a Sherman crew that had lost its loader somewhere east of a town whose name nobody bothered to teach him. The 76mm main gun under his hands is a weapon he has read about. He has watched other men service it. He has never sent a shell out of it toward anything that could shoot back. And now, the turret stinks of cordite and scorched paint, and there are 2 enemy tanks dying in the field ahead, and one of them is his. The loading list had his name spelled wrong. Baker with 2 Ks, a clerk's small carelessness, the kind of thing that outlives the man who made it. What happened next shouldn't have been possible. A crewman who had never once fired the main gun of his tank ended his first engagement with 2 Panthers burning in front of him. Panthers, the best medium tank the German army fielded. Machines whose frontal armor could shrug off a 76 at ranges where the Sherman had no answer at all. That is not how the arithmetic of that war is supposed to run. If your father or your grandfather rode inside one of these steel boxes, or waited in a depot for a number to send him forward, this channel is built for men like him. So subscribe, hit the like, and put his name in the comments, spelled the way he'd have wanted it. Because the story of how Wendell Baker did the impossible in his first 90 seconds of combat is not really a story about luck. It is a story about a system. But that comes later. Right now, there is only the inside of the turret, the ringing in his ears, the tank commander screaming a correction he can barely hear over the intercom's tinny howl. The first Panther had turned its flank to them, a mistake, an enemy officer's bad half-second, and the gunner had put a round through the thin side plate before Baker fully understood what he was looking at. He remembers loading it. He does not remember deciding to. The Germans who fought these battles in the hedgerow country of Normandy did not think they could lose them one-on-one. Their doctrine assumed the Panther and the Tiger would trade well against American armor, 3 or 4 Shermans for every one of theirs, and on the open steppe of the East that math had often held. A German gunner in a Panther expected to see an American tank brew up. He did not expect the reverse, and when it happened, he tended to reach for an explanation that flattered him. A fluke shot, a soft spot, a green crew that would not survive the next minute. That last assumption is the one that killed the second Panther, because the German commander of that second tank did what his training told him to do. He advanced to finish the American who had just embarrassed his comrade, closing the range, presenting his glacis, confident that armor and gun would settle it the way they usually did. He was a professional. His crew was drilled. The Panther's optics were better than the Sherman's, its gun flatter shooting, its reputation earned in a dozen countries. None of that mattered in the fold of ground where Baker's tank was waiting, because the German had walked his flank into the one geometry where a 76 could bite. One of the men who wrote about that country later, a German officer preparing a study for the American army after the war, put it plainly. "We were never defeated by better tanks," he wrote. "We were defeated by more of them, arriving where we did not expect, handled by men we had been told did not exist." His words, not mine. And he was talking about exactly this, the replacement, the number on the loading list, the boy who was not supposed to be a threat. Baker fired the second round himself. The gunner was traversing. The commander was shouting range, and somewhere in the smoke, Baker's hand found the loading motion he had rehearsed 100 times and performed in combat exactly 0, and the breech closed, and the 76 spoke, and the Panther stopped, 2 of them burning in a field in France. A crewman who had never fired the gun before that hour. The records do not tell us what Baker said afterward. They tell us he was there, that the tanks burned, that the arithmetic came out wrong for the men who thought they understood it. To see why, we have to go back. Wendell Baker rode into that turret on a tide of dead men, and the Army knew it when they sent him. The summer of 1944 ate American armor at a rate the planners had not wanted to say out loud. In the 6 weeks after the Normandy landings, the tank battalions bleeding through the hedgerows lost crews faster than the schools back home could finish training new ones, and the men who ran the replacement system faced a choice that had no good answer. They could hold a green soldier back until he was fully qualified and let the fighting companies go into battle short-handed, or they could push him forward half-trained and trust that the veterans already in the tank would finish his education under fire. They chose speed. I think, looking at the numbers, they were right too. And I also think it cost boys like Baker something the ledger never recorded. The pipeline did the same thing to every man who went through it. It pulled him out of a stateside camp as an individual, not part of a unit, and shipped him across the Atlantic as a number on a manifest. Then came the replacement depot. The men called them repple-depples, and nobody who passed through one had a kind word for the place, where he sat in a tent city, waiting for a requisition to claim him. The Army's own historians later admitted the individual replacement system was the weakest link in the whole personnel machine, because it delivered a man to a crew of strangers at the worst possible moment, alone, with no shared training and no one who knew his name. A tank crew is 5 men welded into one nervous system. Baker arrived as a spare part, and the tank he was bolted into had lost its loader 48 hours earlier to a mortar fragment that the surviving crew did not want to talk about. His gunnery amounted to almost nothing. The schedule that was supposed to teach him the 76 had been compressed, then compressed again, and the live fire portion, the part where a man actually feels the gun buck and learns what a hit looks like through the smoke, had been cut to a fraction of what the doctrine specified. He had loaded practice rounds into a stationary gun on a range in England. He had watched instructors demonstrate the traverse and the breech drill. What he had never done was ride a moving tank into a place where the target shot first. And that gap between the classroom and the field is precisely the gap that killed replacements in their opening minutes. The casualty statistics for new men in their first 3 days of combat were savage. A green soldier was several times more likely to die in his first 72 hours than a veteran was over a comparable stretch, because he did not yet know which sounds meant nothing and which sounds meant run. Baker did not have 3 days of experience. He had 90 seconds. So why did the system work at all, if it fed unschooled boys into the meat grinder like this? Because the system was never really about the individual. It was about the aggregate. The United States had decided, at the level of grand strategy, that it would win the ground war through mass, replacement, and continuity. The American way of war was to keep a division in the line and keep pouring men and machines into it, rather than pull it out to rest and rebuild the way the Germans and the British often did. That decision meant a fighting company never went out of existence. It simply absorbed new bodies and kept its guns firing. A German panzer battalion, once ground down, was ground down for good, and its surviving veterans grew more skilled and more scarce with every engagement until there were not enough of them to matter. An American tank company lost its veterans too, but it never lost its slot on the map. The tanks kept coming. The men kept coming. The company that Baker joined had a lineage of dead loaders stretching back to the beach, and it would have another lineage stretching forward past the Rhine, and at no point in that grim succession did the unit stop being combat effective. That is the machine that put a 19-year-old with no live gunnery into a turret in France and expected him to survive contact with the best medium tank in Europe. It was cold. It was, on paper, a terrible bet for the individual man, and it was the single most effective personnel decision of the Western campaign, because it guaranteed that wherever a German commander looked, there would be another American tank, crewed and loaded and waiting, no matter how many he had already burned. Baker was the proof of it, sitting in the smoke holding a shell. The Army treated the manufacture of soldiers exactly the way it treated the manufacture of tanks, and that is not a metaphor. It is an organizational fact you can trace through the paperwork. A man was a unit of throughput. He entered at a reception center, moved down a line of stations that each did one thing to him, and came out the far end, stamped with a military occupational specialty, a number that told the system where he could be slotted. For a tanker, that number meant a compressed cycle at a place like Fort Knox, where the armored force ran men through gunnery, driving, radio, and maintenance on a schedule that assumed a certain number of weeks. Then Normandy happened, and the schedule became a suggestion. Here is what they don't tell you when they show you the clean diagram of the pipeline. The line had a governor on it, and the governor was set by casualties at the far end, not by readiness at the near end. When the tank battalions in France started burning through crews faster than the model predicted, the pressure traveled backward up the pipe, through the depots, across the ocean, into the training centers, and every station shortened its cycle to keep the flow constant. Live fire allocations got trimmed because ammunition and range time were finite, and men were, for the moment, not. The Army was solving for delivery rate, and it hit that target magnificently. The price of hitting it was paid entirely at the muzzle end by boys who had fired the 76 a handful of times, or in Baker's case, not at all against anything that mattered. The repple-depples was the ugliest joint in the whole machine, and the men who ran it knew it. A replacement depot existed to hold human inventory until a requisition pulled it forward, which meant it was designed around waiting, and waiting is corrosive to a soldier. He arrived stripped of the unit that had trained him, sleeping among strangers he would never see again, listening to rumors about which divisions were meat grinders and which were survivable. Nobody drilled him. Nobody knew his name. The Army's own after-action assessments used words like demoralizing and wasteful about these depots. Their words in their reports, written by officers who had built the thing and lived to regret its shape. A soldier could sit in a repple-depples for weeks, losing the edge his training had given him, and then be trucked to a fighting company in a single afternoon, and be in combat before he learned the names of the 4 men whose lives now depended on his hands. The British had looked at this problem and flinched from the American answer. Their manpower was running out by 1944, in a way America's simply was not. so they cannibalized whole divisions to keep others up to strength rather than feed individuals piecemeal into the line. The Germans, when they could, pulled shattered units clean out to rebuild around a cadre of survivors, preserving the veteran core the way you'd preserve a sourdough starter. Both approaches protected the individual soldier better than the American one did. Both approaches also produced fewer combat-effective units on any given morning, because a division out of the line rebuilding is a division not fighting. Which brings us back to the cold arithmetic that put Baker in the turret. The United States accepted a worse deal for the individual man in exchange for never once having a hole in its line. And the math worked because of the number behind the number. American industry was shipping tanks by the tens of thousands. The Sherman alone ran past 49,000 built, and the training base, for all its rushed cycles, was producing crewmen at a rate that kept those tanks manned. The German gunner who brewed up an American Sherman had, in a real sense, accomplished nothing strategic, because the tank was replaceable off an assembly line in Michigan, and the crew was replaceable out of a depot in France, and both replacements were already in motion before his own barrel had cooled. He was bailing a rising river with a helmet. The better his aim, the faster the next target arrived. That is the system that made green men and shipped them forward by the thousand, undertrained on purpose, because the strategy had decided that presence beat proficiency at the scale of an entire theater. It was industrial, and in its indifference to the individual, a little bit horrifying. It was also the reason a German commander could win every duel his optics and his gun deserved to win and still lose the campaign, because he was fighting a factory, and the factory did not run out. Baker was one green rivet in that machine, and in about 90 seconds, the machine was going to be vindicated in the worst possible way for the man in the second Panther. On the German side of that hedgerow, the man in the second Panther belonged to a breed the Wehrmacht could no longer manufacture. He had learned his trade the expensive way, over 2 or 3 years, and a continent's worth of dead comrades, and he carried in his hands a kind of knowledge that no schoolhouse in the Reich could shortcut any more. He knew, without thinking, the difference between a hull-down Sherman and one that had merely halted. He knew the sound, a 76 made against sloped armor. He was, by any honest measure, a better tanker than the boy who killed him. And that is exactly the point the German High Command kept refusing to absorb, because a veteran like that was a wasting asset, and the arithmetic of his side had no way to replace him. Every month of 1944 thinned the ranks of seasoned Panther crews, and every replacement Berlin sent forward was younger, hastier, worse. The German training pipeline was strangling on fuel shortages and lost time, and the men coming out of it got fewer hours behind the optics, not more. The Reich was doing to its own tankers exactly what America was doing to Baker, except America was doing it on purpose and could afford the waste, and Germany was doing it because it was bleeding out and had no choice. That is the cruelty hidden inside the comparison. The German crewman's excellence was a candle burning down. Baker's mediocrity was a river with a source in Michigan. What that meant on the ground, one field at a time, was this. When the veteran in the second Panther brewed up a Sherman, he removed from the war 1 tank and on a bad afternoon 5 men, and he felt correctly that he had won something. But the company that owned that Sherman did not cease to exist. A radio call went back, a requisition went forward, and within a day or two, a fresh hull rolled up with a fresh crew, and one of those crewmen might be a 19-year-old who had never fired the main gun. The German had subtracted one from a number that refilled itself overnight. When Baker's crew brewed up that same veteran, they removed from the war a man the Wehrmacht could never adequately replace, and a Panther that Germany was building at a fraction of the American rate. The exchange looked even on the battlefield. It was catastrophically lopsided on the ledger, and the ledger is where wars of this scale are actually decided. Their veterans killed our beginners at a favorable ratio, and lost the campaign doing it. That is not a paradox. It is the whole design. The German generals understood this eventually, and some of them wrote it down for the Americans after the war in the Foreign Military Studies series that the U.S. Army commissioned from its captured enemies. Read enough of those reports, and a theme surfaces that has nothing to do with tanks and everything to do with what stood behind the tanks. One general officer, surveying the collapse of the Western Front, reached for the word inexhaustible to describe the American replacement stream, not the quality of the men, which he rated frankly, sometimes contemptuously, but the sheer refusal of the flow to stop. That was the thing that broke him, not the individual Sherman crewman, whom he considered his inferior right up to the end. The multitude of him. The myth of German tactical genius leaves something out. The genius was real, and it was not enough, and the men who possessed it knew it was not enough while they were still winning their little duels. A Panther commander could survey a burning field, count 4 American wrecks against his one loss, and file an honest report claiming victory, and know, in the same breath, that the 4 would be back next week and his one would not. That knowledge is corrosive in a way no statistic captures. It is the specific despair of a professional who has done everything right and watches it not matter. The better he fought, the clearer it became that fighting well was not the variable that decided anything. Which returns us to the boy in the turret, holding a shell he was barely trained to load. The American system did not ask Baker to be the equal of the man he was about to kill. It never intended him to be. It asked only that he be present, crewed, loaded, and in the way. One more hull in one more field, backed by 1,000 more behind him, and 1,000 more behind those. His individual excellence was never the weapon. He was the weapon's ammunition, and the weapon was the flow itself, and the man in the second Panther was about to become the last and most authoritative witness to how it worked. The lane opened without warning, the way they always did in the bocage. 1 second, the Sherman was grinding down a sunken track walled in by hedge, engine noise bouncing off the earth banks, and the next, the track spilled into the open shoulder of a field, and there they were, 2 Panthers, hull down along the far tree line, no more than 300 yards off, close enough that the crew could read the mud on their road wheels. The lead German was already traversing. That is the detail that decides everything, and it is the detail Baker never saw, because Baker was not looking out. Loaders do not look out. He was folded into the left side of the turret basket, with his eyes on the breech and his hands on a rack of ready rounds, waiting for one word. The word came, and it was the only piece of his rushed instruction that mattered now. The gunner called for armor piercing, and Baker did the single thing 10 minutes on a stationary gun in England had drilled into his hands. He pulled around, swung it into the breech, and shoved. That is the whole of it. He did not aim, did not range, did not decide. He fed the gun. The 76's breech block slammed shut on the shell, and the electrical firing circuit went live, and everything Baker had been sent forward to do was already done in under 3 seconds, before he had fully registered that the shapes in the tree line were the thing the whole war had been arranging to put in front of him. What saved them was not Baker, and it was not the tank. It was the commander. The man in the cupola had been in the hedgerows since June, and when the track opened, he did the veteran's thing without a syllable of hesitation. He called the halt, called the target, called the traverse, and called the round. 4 commands stacked so fast they sounded like one, and the crew's welded nervous system did the rest around the one green cell in it. The gunner laid the reticle on the nearer Panther's flank, the softer aspect, the place a 76 could actually punch through, because the German had shown him that flank in the half-second it took to swing his own long gun around. That half-second is the entire margin. The Panther was the better tank, and the German was the better tanker, and both of those facts were true, and both of those facts were about to lose to sequence, because the American had fired first by a hair, and in a knife fight at 300 yards first is the only statistic that pays. The round crossed the field faster than the eye tracks and struck the lead Panther low on the hull side. Whether it holed the fighting compartment clean, or set the ammunition, or opened a fuel cell, the after-action language does not specify, and I am not going to pretend the record says more than it does. What the record says is that the tank brewed up. A Panther that takes a penetrating hit into its ammunition stowage does not burn politely. It gouts, a hard orange bloom followed by the flat black column that every man in the bocage learned to read from a mile off, and the crew who could get out came out through the hatches already on fire, and the crew who could not stayed inside with the roaring. Baker did not watch that either. Baker was reaching for the next round, because the gunner was already shouting for it, because there was a second Panther, and the second Panther had not yet fired. That is the moment the fight actually balanced on, and it balanced there for the length of one breath. The surviving German now knew exactly where the Sherman was. His companion's death had marked the spot in fire, and he had his gun and his optics and his years, and all he needed was the 2 or 3 seconds to bring the long 75 around onto a stationary target he could no longer miss. Against him stood a crew who had to reload and relay before he did, and the reload was in the hands of the man with no live gunnery, the spare part, the number off the manifest, the boy the system had shipped forward undertrained on purpose and dropped into a turret 48 hours ago among 4 strangers. The professional handling was not Baker's. It belonged to the commander who had already shifted the traverse, and the gunner who was tracking the second hull before the first stopped moving, and the whole machinery of a company that never went out of existence. Baker's part was smaller than that, and larger than that at once. He had one job, and the second Panther was swinging its gun, and everything now depended on whether the green rivet could seat around into that breach before a veteran finished the motion he had begun 2 years and a continent ago. How does a boy who never fired a tank gun end up putting the killing round into a Panther crew that had lived through the Eastern Front? The honest answer is that the record thins out right here, at the exact moment it matters most, and the gaps in it are the gaps where men were too busy surviving to keep notes. What survives is the shape of the thing, and the shape is enough. Baker got the second round seated. That much the account is firm on, and it is the fulcrum the whole story turns on, because a Sherman that could not reload in those 2 or 3 seconds was a dead Sherman, and every man in it knew the timetable in his spine. The breech took the shell, the block rode up and locked, and the gun was live again before the German finished his traverse. Whatever else was true about Baker's training, his hands did the one motion they had been given, under a pressure that folds veterans, and they did not fumble it. That is not nothing. It is the entire American theory of the war, reduced to a single pair of hands in a single steel box. Then, the account does something I did not expect when I first read it. It puts Baker on the gun. The gunner. Sources conflict on whether he was hit by Spall through the vision port or simply thrown when the tank lurched. Came off the controls in the seconds after the first shot. And the commander, screaming for fire onto the second hull, had a loaded gun and no one laying it. Baker was the man in reach. He slid into the gunner's seat with the reticle already roughly on the tree line, and he did the only thing anyone had ever shown him about a sight picture, which was to put the mark on the enemy and press. He did not range it. He did not lead it. At 300 yards against a tank that had not yet moved, there was nothing to lead, and the 76's trajectory was flat enough over that distance that a rough lay was a lethal lay. He fired. The round hit the second Panther. The German gun never came all the way around. Here is where the enemy becomes the witness, because the Americans inside that Sherman could not have reconstructed what happened in the other tank, and the men who could were mostly dead. But the Wehrmacht ran on veterans who compared notes, and the bewilderment that surfaces afterward in captured tankers' talk and in the post-war foreign military studies is specific, and it is repeated. The Germans could not understand how they kept losing gunnery duels they had, by every measure of skill, already won. One panzer officer, debriefed after the war, put it in words that have stayed with me. He said the Americans shot like men who did not know it was difficult. He meant it as contempt. He was describing the exact thing that killed his friends. A trained gunner knows all the ways a shot can go wrong, and at knife range, that knowledge is a tax on his hands. Baker did not know it was difficult, so he simply put the mark on the tank and let the gun do what the gun was built to do. The second Panther brewed up the way the first had, and now there were 2 columns of that flat black smoke standing over the field, and the men who came out of the hatches came out burning, and the men who did not stayed with the roar. I said earlier, I would not pretend the record says more than it does. It does not say how many of the 8 or 10 Germans in those 2 crews got out. It says the tanks burned, and it says the Sherman lived, and it lets the reader do the arithmetic the German High Command spent 3 years refusing to do. Think about what actually happened on that field, one field of 10,000. The better tank lost. The better tanker lost. The men with 2 years and a continent of survival behind them lost to a boy who had been in the turret for 48 hours and had never fired the gun he killed them with. And it was not luck, or not only luck, because the American system had built a machine designed to make exactly this outcome likely. To put a loaded gun and a live crew in that field no matter what, and to keep putting them there after every loss, until the law of averages did to the German veterans what no single American could. The candle burned down that afternoon. 2 of them did, in the same field, inside one breath of each other, and the river out of Michigan did not so much as slow. A canteen cup, dented, still half full of ersatz coffee, sat wedged in the sponson rack of a third Panther that had held back at the edge of the wood, and watch both of its companions die inside one breath. The crew of that tank got the closest thing the Wehrmacht had to a clean look at what happened, and what they carried away was not a tactical lesson about flanks or fields of fire. They had seen a Sherman take a duel it had no business winning, against a gun that outranged and outpenetrated their own, and they had seen it done fast and done twice. That is the observation that starts to rot a man from the inside, because it cannot be filed under bad luck, and it cannot be filed under enemy brilliance, and those were the only two folders a professional had. The frightening part was not that the Americans were good. Veterans can respect good. Good is a thing you train against, a thing you can imagine beating on a better day with a better position. The frightening part, the part that surfaces again and again in the wiretapped conversations the British and Americans recorded at Trent Park, is that the Americans did not have to be good. A captured Panzer general talking to another captured general who he did not know was being recorded, worked his way around this and could not make it come out even. His army had the better tank. His army had the better crews, man for man, and he said so with the flat certainty of a man stating that water runs downhill. And his army was losing anyway, field by field, to an enemy he rated below his own, and the only variable left that could explain it was one he did not want to say out loud, which was that quality had stopped mattering. Think about what that does to a soldier's entire theory of himself. A man survives the Eastern Front on the belief that skill keeps him alive, that the reason he is breathing and the man beside him is not, comes down to what he learned and how well he learned it. That belief is load-bearing. It is the thing that lets him climb back into the tank the next morning. And here was the American system, quietly informing him that his skill was a rounding error, that the boy he had been about to kill could kill him back with 48 hours of training and no gunnery at all, because there would always be one more loaded Sherman in one more lane, and the odds only ran one direction over enough repetitions. What the burning crews understood, in the seconds they had to understand anything, was that they were not fighting men. They were fighting a rate. You cannot outskill a rate. You can only feed it, one veteran at a time, until the veterans run out. The smell reached the 3rd Panthers crew before the smoke thinned, the particular reek of a tank fire, rubber and cordite and diesel, and the thing under those that no one who has smelled it ever mistakes for anything else, rolling across 300 yards of Norman grass on a July afternoon. They backed their tank into the trees and left. The record does not say where they went, and it does not matter, because wherever they went, the arithmetic went with them and got no better. That is the reversal this whole story has been building toward, and I want to state it plainly, because the men who lived it mostly could not. The German High Command spent the war believing that if they built the best tank and trained the best crews, the numbers would somehow be forgiven them. The foreign military studies are full of that hope, curdling into recognition, general after general reaching for the same helpless vocabulary, inexhaustible, endless, a flood, a machine, to describe an enemy whose individual soldiers they still, even in defeat, considered their inferiors. They were not wrong about Baker. Baker was their inferior. On the morning of that fight, by every measure a soldier is trained to respect. And Baker killed 2 of them anyway, and that is the sentence that should have ended the argument in Berlin 3 years before it actually ended. The American way of war did not promise that any one man would be brave enough, or fast enough, or skilled enough. It promised only that there would be another one, and another after that, crewed and fueled and loaded and dropped into the lane, no matter how many had burned in it before. Wendell Baker never fired a tank gun before that afternoon. By the time the two columns of smoke leaned together over the field and started to drift, he had done the only thing the machine had ever needed him to do, which was to be there and to be enough, and against the best tanker in that tree line, being enough was the whole of it. The Germans tried to solve it, and this part gets overlooked. They were not stupid men, and they did not simply throw up their hands. Their answer was to build the tank thicker, the gun longer, the crews better, to push the exchange ratio so far in their favor that no flood could drown them. 5 Shermans for every Panther, 6, whatever number the math demanded. The Tiger battalions kept ledgers, and the ledgers were, on their own terms, triumphant. A single Tiger crew could account for its dozen, its 2 dozen, its column of burning American hulls strung down a road, and the tally in the war diary read like a victory. It was a victory locally, on the afternoon it happened. The riddle was that it changed nothing. The tank that killed its dozen Shermans was itself a single tank, and when it threw a track or ran dry of the fuel, the Reich no longer had, or simply broke the way complicated machines break. There was no Wendell Baker waiting in the German rear to climb into a fresh one. The Americans could lose the exchange and win the war. That is not a paradox. It is just arithmetic that runs on a clock the Germans could not reset. They could not copy it either, and that is the harder problem. Copying the replacement machine did not mean building a better school. It meant having the men to feed the school, and the factories to arm them, and the shipping to carry them, and the fuel to move them once they arrived, all at once, all in surplus, and Germany had exactly none of those in surplus by the summer Baker went forward. A nation copies a rival's tactics in a season, and a rival's technology in a year or two. It cannot copy a rival's population, its untouched industry, its 2 oceans of insulation, or the decision made a generation earlier to build the kind of country that produces 60,000 tank crewmen a year and does not particularly notice the expense. The foreign military studies circle this without ever quite landing on it. The generals keep looking for the German mistake, the doctrine they got wrong, the order that should have been countermanded, because a mistake can be learned from and fixed. What they were actually up against had no fix in it. There was nothing to correct because nothing had gone wrong tactically. They were simply outnumbered by a system that treated their best crews as a consumable. So what was Baker? That is the question the section title promises, and I am not going to pretend to close it, because the record will not let me, and because I think closing it would be a lie. Lucky, certainly. The gunner went down in the 1 second that put him on the controls. The Panther had shown its flank. 300 yards was close enough that ignorance cost nothing. Gifted, maybe. Some men are steady with their hands under a pressure that shakes everyone else, and no schoolhouse tests for it until the shooting starts. Or simply the round that happened to be chambered when the trigger got pulled. One interchangeable unit that performed exactly to specification and would have been just as dead and just as replaced if it had gone the other way. Pick whichever you like. The machine did not care which was true. It was built so that the answer would not matter. Wendell Baker had been in the turret for 48 hours. He had fired a tank gun before that afternoon for 0 minutes at a live enemy, and roughly 10 at a stationary target in England. In the span of one engagement that the after-action report covers in a single paragraph, 2 Panthers burned. An unknown number of a nation's most expensive soldiers died in them, and a third crew backed into the trees and drove off to lose the war somewhere else. The 2 tanks together had cost the Reich something north of 600,000 Reichsmarks, and the better part of 5 years spent training the men inside them. Baker had cost the United States a train ticket and a rushed week at a depot. The exchange rate that afternoon ran a little in America's favor. The field is in Normandy, and you can stand in it. It grows wheat now, or grazes cattle depending on the year, a shallow rectangle of green walled in by the same hedges, and the sunken track still runs down one side of it, exactly where the Sherman came grinding out into the open. Farmers turned up shell fragments there for decades, plowing. The 2 burned Panthers were dragged off and cut up for scrap before the wheat came back. It came back the following summer.